All right, if we're ready to start the final panel for today, I am happy to announce that Professor Fisher has survived. This is not a reincarnation. The interesting thing about this panel is it's a direct continuation of the discussion we just had. So as the discussion turned in the last panel to war powers, we are going to turn very clearly to that now. We've already introduced two of our panelists. I'm just going to briefly introduce you again. Louis Fisher is a scholar in residence at the Constitution Project. And some people in the room may not truly appreciate the position of Louis Fisher. Louis Fisher is as close as constitutional the law academy can get to a founding father. He has spent 4 decades as this unassailable voice on the Constitution. And what's unique about Louis is that in his 4 decades as senior specialist on separation of powers, and I cannot tell you how central that role is in Congress, he was the voice of reason for both Republicans and Democrats. I'm very happy to say that his first publication, it might be his first, was at George Washington University Law Review in 1969, and so we take a completely unreasonable claim to have contributed to the man who is Louis Fisher. I won't repeat his credentials, but it is one of the great honors whenever I can appear with Louis Fisher. Professor Paulson is an absolutely unique academic in terms of his background. First of all, he had a brilliant educational background. He has a degree from the Yale Divinity School, as well as Yale Law School, where he was an editor on the Yale Law Journal. So he can both criticize your ideas and condemn your soul, which is very, very useful. But he also, what is interesting about Professor Paulson, this is why this center is so extraordinary and the people that they pull together, is that Professor Paulson has walked the walk. He just doesn't talk the talk. He's actually been in critical positions looking at these issues in government, and including his work as an attorney advisor with the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the real cutting edge of policy in the U.S. government. And he is, of course, with the University of St. Thomas School of Law. Now, our addition is someone who I'm very familiar with and very proud to have an association with, and that's Professor David Moore. My association is that Professor Moore was on our faculty at George Washington as a visiting scholar. And he also, as with our other panelists, has a wide range of publications from Harvard, Columbia, Virginia, Northwestern Law Reviews, and a resume that is just quite stellar. He teaches civil procedure, international law, U.S. foreign relations, international human rights, legal scholarship. It's an incredible resume. He's also a member of the American Law Institute. He clerked for Sam Alito, and I believe it was both on the Third Circuit and the Supreme Court, which is itself a wonderful accomplishment. He has taught at the University of Chicago Law School as an Orland Fellow. For those of you not familiar, these are extremely prestigious positions to secure. And he is now at the Brigham Young Law School, where he graduated. He graduated summa cum laude at Brigham Young Law School, then became editor-in-chief of the law school, and graduated first in his class. The only reason I laugh is because whenever I read David's resume, I think, this is the guy I hated my entire life. He's the guy you look around at the new kids in the class and you're like, oh God, David Moore's in this class. There goes the curve. So why don't we start with the curve breaker, David Moore.
It's far too kind. I have long looked up to Jonathan and his amazing energy in being a public commentator, a prolific scholar, and an active practicing attorney in important decisions. So it's a pleasure to be with him and with Professor Fisher and Professor Paulson as well. So what I want to do today is start off, let's see if I can get this up, looking at the approach the Supreme Court uses to assess claims of presidential power and talk about how these approaches motivate the court, lead the court to expand presidential power over time, or at least include those pressures. And then focus the discussion a little bit more particularly on war powers. So when the Supreme Court talks about assessing presidential power, they make statements, often start opinions with statements like, the president acts legally if he can identify power in the Constitution or power from Congress that support his actions. And so we have these two primary sources, or a combination of them, for assessing whether the president is within the scope of his authority. One, obviously the Constitution. I'll talk a little bit about how the court assesses the president's constitutional powers. And then two, just looking to Congress and whether Congress has passed statutes authorizing the president to take certain acts. And this is, particularly in my area, foreign relations law, sort of a ubiquitous dynamic. I mean, Congress has passed all sorts of statutes delegating authority to the president, and this in other areas. So, for example, with the Iran agreement, right, the agreement was that the president would use power under statutes that Congress had enacted, giving him discretion over sanctions on Iran. He would use that delegated power to reduce those sanctions in exchange for Iran's actions to reduce its nuclear program, right? But just examples of some of the statutes Congress has passed to authorize the president to take action. All right, so when we look at the president's constitutional authority, there are a variety of approaches or themes that we see in the Supreme Court's opinions, right? They'll often cobble together several of these provisions from the Constitution or approaches to constitutional interpretation to assess whether the president has power under the Constitution to take the acts in question. So first off, the court might look at the president's enumerated powers, right? The specific grants of authority to the president in the Constitution. And these are relatively few. In foreign affairs, we're talking about the commander-in-chief power, the power to send and receive ambassadors, and the power to make treaties, with the power to send ambassadors and the power to make treaties tied to the Senate, where the Senate has to confirm those nominations and treaties. So the court will look at these powers and inferences that can be drawn from them to decide whether the president has constitutional power to, again, engage in the act in question. So, for example, last term, several months ago, the Supreme Court handed down a decision implying from the president's receive ambassador power, as well as some of these other powers mentioned, an exclusive power in the president to decide what government to recognize of a foreign state, as well as when to recognize a foreign state, including when to recognize the territorial boundaries or to set the territorial boundaries of that state. And the court did this in a case where Congress had tried to tell the executive to treat Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. contrary to executive policy on that question, and the court said Congress couldn't do that, again, based in part on the president's enumerated powers. So one approach for the court in assessing the president's constitutional power is to look at these enumerations and inferences that can be drawn from them. Another constitutional hook in the text is the vesting clause that the court can rely on, which says that the president is vested with the executive power. What this means is still very much an open question. There are those who would argue that this is a very broad grant of power, that there are powers that are executive in nature, and this grants all those powers to the president. Others might say this simply clarifies that we're creating a separate executive in our new constitutional system. Unlike under the Articles of Confederation, where we had Congress alone, we are now creating another branch, and it will be the executive branch, and that the executive powers are what are enumerated after that clause and are not expanded by that clause. But there is that source of power as well, or that clause in the Constitution that the court can turn to. A third constitutional source would be the Take Care Clause, where in Article 2, the Constitution says that the president will take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And this may be simply a duty, but has been understood in many circumstances to also be an authorization of power, right? That the president has authority to execute the law beyond just a duty to do so. So there are questions about to the extent to which this clause is an independent grant of power to the president. The court will often look to history, right? Because the Constitution doesn't say a lot, doesn't settle a lot when it comes to presidential power. We'll look to see what presidents have done since the founding. And we've heard a lot of that in the discussion in the prior panel. And we'll look to see whether Congress has protested, right? So in this recognition case that I just mentioned, the court looked to see the extent to which the president has had since the founding asserted an exclusive recognition power and the extent to which Congress acquiesced in that. The court might also rely on functionalist rationales, saying that the president is best suited to assume certain powers because the president can act with uniformity, with speed, with secrecy, pursuant to sources of information that the Congress does not have ready access to. And for that reason, we ought to find that the president possesses a constitutional power. And finally, there's this very broad argument that as a sovereign nation, the United States has certain powers, and the president can exercise those at least until he meets opposition from the other political branch, Congress. One of the themes I think that runs throughout each of these methods of identifying the president's constitutional powers is that there is a lot of space for discretion. These sources or these ways of analyzing the president's powers are not determinate. And so there are big questions that a court would have to resolve to settle the scope of the president's power, relying on these 6 approaches or methods. The result is that the court, I think, has an incentive to avoid settling the constitutional scope of the president's power. Again, these present big questions, and if we don't have to answer those, great. Right? And that leads the court to have an incentive to resolve these questions by reference to Congress. What does Congress say about what the president has done? Right? Does the Congress think this is appropriate? Has Congress authorized it? Has Congress acquiesced in it? And it's easier to resolve these presidential power cases by reference to Congress than it is to settle these big constitutional questions through these approaches that I mentioned that, again, don't provide ready answers. And so, again, it incentivizes the court to look to Congress to resolve these presidential power questions. Well, when we're looking at the relationship of the President and Congress. The accepted framework for doing that is Justice Jackson's framework from the famous Youngstown decision. And I want to talk a little bit about this to draw out the incentives that this approach gives the courts when it's addressing presidential power issues. Right? Justice Jackson said that the president's power fluctuates in relation to the position of Congress on the particular issue, and so we can sort of place presidential acts along a spectrum with regard to Congress. And in the top of the spectrum, or in the first rough category, Category 1, we have situations where Congress has passed a statute and authorized the president to take the challenged action. The court says that in these Category 1 cases, the president's power is at its zenith. The court will rule for the president in these cases. The president wins unless the court concludes that the federal government as a whole lacks the power to take this action. Because otherwise we've got both Congress giving its authorization, invoking its power to endorse this action, and the president using his or her power to do the same thing. And to be able to say this is unconstitutional, we just have to say that the political branches of the federal government simply can't engage in this behavior. So Category 1 cases are easy cases. If we conclude that a case is a Category 1 case, the court can say the president wins. And again, doesn't need to say that the president wins on constitutional grounds or because of some constitutional power, right, but because Congress has approved the president's acts. Category 2, in Category 2 fall cases where Congress has remained silent. We don't know Congress's position. And Justice Jackson said that these cases lie in a twilight zone, where essentially we can't predict up front how that case is going to come out. In these cases, the president's and Congress's power may be concurrent. Congress's inaction may be said to invite the president to act, but that doesn't mean necessarily the president has acted constitutionally. And so Jackson said, we just have to look at the facts of each case. Again, we aren't going to be able to resolve these as an abstract matter up front. The result is that Category 2 cases are very difficult. Right? A court does not want to end up in Category 2 because there's very little guidance on how to resolve that case. Category 3 is a little bit more determinate, but also raises some hard questions. Category 3 cases are those in which Congress has disapproved of the president's acts. And in these cases, the court says that the president's power is at its lowest ebb, so the president is likely to lose, but will not inevitably lose, because there can be situations where the president is exercising an exclusive power. So in this recognition case, Congress tried to tell the executive to treat Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in passports. And the president or the State Department refused, right? So we have a Category 3 case, but the president won, the executive won in that case, because the court concluded that the president has an exclusive constitutional power to decide these recognition questions. But the result is that in these Category 3 cases, if you conclude that the president is acting contrary to Congress's will, the court has to go back to those constitutional questions, right? And has to answer those big questions, or at least deal with those indeterminate sources of history, etc. The result is that because I think Category 2 and Category 3 present some real tangles for the executive, there is an incentive for the courts to conclude that a case fits within Category 1. And so sort of the nature of the analysis here tends toward presidential power, right? Tends toward a finding that the president has acted within his power as a result of congressional approval. And we've seen this, there's a famous case involving the Iran hostages and the president's effort to resolve the Iran hostage crisis. And in that case, the court said, we can't find any statutes that expressly authorize the president to do what he's done. But we'll sort of look at what the court said, called the general tenor of legislation in this area. And there we find that Congress is open to presidential discretion in these difficult foreign affairs matters, and open to the president settling international disputes. And so the court concluded that, again, although there wasn't any express statutory authorization, this was nonetheless a Category 1 case, and the president won. And again, this is consistent with the underlying pressures in this Jackson framework to avoid Category 2 or 3, where you don't know what the answer is going to be, or where you have to resolve difficult questions and try and resolve cases through Category 1. So the way the court addresses these presidential problems, power problems, I think, has a built-in incentive to expand presidential power. These approaches also, I think, incentivize the president. So the second problem with the way the court approaches these is that it creates an incentive in the president to avoid Congress. And so we've seen recently the Obama administration struggling with, do I want to go to Congress and try and get approval? Should we go it alone? And I think, all things being equal, the incentive is to go it alone, because if the president acts unilaterally and ends up in court, the president can try to cobble together evidence of support from Congress, as happened in this Iran hostage crisis case, where the court couldn't find a statute that authorized, but could find sort of policies in different statutes and some history that supported a conclusion of congressional approval. If the president decides to go to Congress, there's the risk that Congress will disapprove of what the president is proposing, and the president then is in Category 3. As the executive thinks about its strategy and is influenced by the court's approach to these questions, the executive wants to get in Category 1, and unless it's quite clear that the president can get congressional approval, it makes sense not to go to Congress, and again, try to gather your evidence together when the court is looking at the case, if in fact it gets there. One other incentive, I think, or dynamic that is evident in the way the court approaches these presidential power cases, and particularly the Jackson framework, is that the court does not evaluate why Congress might have approved the president's actions. Right? So under the Jackson framework, if we can just find congressional approval, we know the outcome, and the president will win. The problem is that Congress is not always a great steward of its own power, right, or its institutional interests. It does not engage in the sort of checks and balances dynamic that Madison anticipated. And so presidents will act and Congress will remain silent for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's difficult to overcome the barriers to passing law. Right? So there's a difficulty in looking to Congress to find approval if we're finding approval in congressional silence or acquiescence. But even if we have authorization from Congress, there are reasons to be skeptical. The political science literature has identified many reasons why Congress might enact affirmative authorization for the president to take action. Those reasons are not grounded in separation of powers or checks and balances. So, for example, one of the observations is that members of Congress care about re-election. That's one of their top priorities. And in an area like foreign affairs, the electorate may not be as concerned about what Congress is doing as it is in, say, with health care or with Social Security or other more domestic matters. And so members of Congress may have an incentive to delegate to the president decisions in this area of foreign affairs and authorize the president to decide how we're going to act, and then spend their time on matters that their constituents care more about. Similarly, members of Congress might conclude that the president is better suited to answer certain questions, right? Invoke that functionalism to say the president has some pragmatic advantages that we don't, and so it makes sense for the president to decide these questions. Again, in the foreign affairs area, that would be prominent. Say the president can negotiate directly, the president can act quickly, the president can act decisively, etc. Let's let the president decide how to handle this. The problem is that the Constitution is not, at least entirely, based on functionalism. The Constitution meant to make the government, the federal government, ineffective in some ways to prevent that concentration of power. And so, notwithstanding the functional advantages of a president, Congress didn't let the president make treaties alone or send ambassadors alone, etc. It checked that power by divvying up those responsibilities. And so Congress may nonetheless authorize the president to take action for these functionalist sort of reasons in ways that are inconsistent with a rigorous checks and balances. The Jackson framework doesn't take account of those problems, right? Those separation of powers problems, the fact that Congress will authorize for reasons that are inconsistent with the constitutional system. Instead, if we see authorization, the case is done, and the court simply sort of rubber stamps or piles on to that delegation of power to the president. So, I think one of the dynamics, again, we have seen, particularly in the foreign affairs area, is that the way the court goes about assessing presidential power pushes the court toward expansion of presidential authority. Let me say a little bit about that then in the context of war powers, which we've seen these dynamics at play in the war powers context recently. So we've had two prominent authorizations for the use of military force recently. The 2001 AUMF that followed 9/11, where the president was given authority to use force against organizations associated with Al-Qaeda. And the 2002 authorization for the use of military force in Iraq, right? Both using fairly broad language. The president can use necessary and appropriate force, or use the armed forces in necessary and appropriate ways. As a result of these AUMFs, we've seen the president or presidents take expansive actions in this area, right? So these AUMFs, the 9/11 AUMF has been used to justify detention, including detention of U.S. citizens categorized as enemy combatants. And in the Hamdi decision, 5 members of the court looked to that AUMF, applied Jackson's framework, said this is category 1, and so the president is acting within the scope of his authority. The president has relied outside the courts And we'll see the extent to which this is overseen by the courts, but has relied on these authorizations for the use of military force to conduct drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen. Again, the approach, the framework for assessing these questions of presidential power puts the president in fairly good stead, at least as a separation of powers matter, in conducting these drone strikes. Finally, we've seen this in the context of ISIS as well, where the president has relied on these AUMFs to engage in the military action in Iraq and then bleeding over into Syria, where the legal justification sort of changed to a self-defense rationale because it's hard to rely on the AUMF with regard to Iraq or with regard to al-Qaeda when you're in Syria bombing ISIS. But again, I think what we see here is although these doctrines, these approaches are not determinate, right? They don't dictate how the court's going to come out. They leave the court a lot of discretion. I think there are some internal dynamics to these approaches that we see in the war powers area that have led to the expansion of presidential power both in the courts and have sort of emboldened the president to take action outside the court on the grounds that he's able to justify himself under these frameworks. So I'll stop there.